What had happened is we had let life and all the busyness and the stress crowd out the emotional intimacy that we had shared as a couple. We purposed that we were never going to let that happen again. That if we would just do the hard work here and there to keep the trail clear, then we wouldn't have to spend hours trying to forge a new path toward intimacy. When I think about emotional intimacy in marriage, I can't help but think about a hike I took with my husband a number of years ago. I had heard about this place, Paradise Falls, for a long time. He had gone in his 20s with his friends, and they had had all kinds of crazy antics, jumping from cliffs into these amazing pools. And so I was really excited to actually see it for myself. It took us a few hours just to get to the trailhead. And when we got there, it was a fairly steep technical trail down to the falls. But it only took 30 minutes or so before we were staring up at granite cliffs with beautiful crystal clear water flowing into these pools. And as we sat on those rocks, we thought about some changes that were coming up in our life. And we just had our first daughter, and I was pregnant with our second, and we were getting ready to leave the state and begin a new season of ministry. But we were excited about the changes and excited about doing it together. Well, a few years later, we found ourselves knee-deep in ministry. We were exhausted most of the time, little kids running around trying to corral them. It was just that season of life where emotional intimacy was really difficult to find. And there were ups and there were downs, but by the end of those years, we were just exhausted and we were feeling really far from each other. And one of those twists of life, we ended up moving back to the Sierra Nevada, to the same place that we had lived years before. And we decided to go back to Paradise Falls together. Except this time, when we got to that trailhead, it was completely different. The landscape was different and our hearts were different. The trail itself was overgrown with grasses and huge manzanita bushes crowding it out, and there was poison oak over half of the forest floor in places. We had brought these little pinking shears, and so we were trying to clip back everything, and it took us hours and hours to get down to the falls. And when we finally got there, it was unchanged. The rocks that we sat on were the exact same. The falls were just as majestic, just as beautiful. The sky was blue. There were little chickadees trilling in the willow bushes. It was beautiful and so peaceful. And our hearts had changed too. After all that blood, sweat, and tears of getting to that place, something had changed in our hearts, and that work that we had done together created a bond and an intimacy again in our relationship. And there was such a stark contrast that day of thinking about the first time we had gone to the falls and the second time and what had transpired in between. What had happened is we had let life and all the busyness and the stress crowd out the emotional intimacy that we had shared as a couple. And so that second trip to Paradise Falls, we purposed that we were never going to let that happen again. That if we would just do the hard work here and there to keep the trail clear, then we wouldn't have to spend hours trying to forge a new path toward intimacy. Now, we haven't had the luxury of long weekends away together, or even necessarily a regular date night, but for us, we enjoy taking walks together or playing a game or even taking a drive together. Just having focused time without distractions where we're doing something together has made a big difference. And of course, physical intimacy in marriage is a big deal. And that can often go hand in hand with having a trail that has been overgrown. And so it can be difficult to kind of detangle the two of those. So do whatever it takes, whether it's compromising together or getting professional counseling, but to make sure that you're having health in that area of your relationship. So what's the state of your trail? Are you feeling like it's overgrown? Has it been a long time since you felt close to your spouse? Whether your trail needs a big overhaul with a lot of hacking or whether you just need a little bit of upkeep to maintain that trail. What's one thing you can do today to reclaim emotional intimacy in your marriage? Making time to be together as a couple can be especially difficult when you have young kids at home, especially if you don't have funds for a babysitter or you live far from family. When our kids were little, we fell into both of those categories, so I totally get it. I don't have all the answers because it's just a difficult situation, but one thing that really helped us was something I like to call an early bedtime. It really is amazing. It's one of the perks of being the boss, actually. When our kids were young, we were very careful about not being busy in the evening, so we scaled back on activities. And when they were toddlers, we're talking like a 6:30, 7 o'clock bedtime, and there was always the one who came out thirsty or hungry or itchy or needing a stuffed animal. But after we got them all corralled back in bed, we still had substantial time to just be together. And some nights we were so exhausted we just read a book or watched a show, but that was one way that we were able to carve out a space for us to talk about things that were important to us as a couple. Now our kids are older now, but we still have this tradition. The window of time that we have is getting much shorter as their bedtime is encroaching on my bedtime. But we still have the habit of sitting in bed together, reading a book, talking about our day, and it's a good habit to cultivate. So whether you have funds for a babysitter, whether you live far from family, don't let that stop you from being intentional about carving time together to just be together, even if it means being the bad guy and having to put your kids to bed early. Any other women out there have a really hard time taking care of ourselves and making sure that we're healthy so that we can give to others? I was reminded of this in such a powerful way recently, where someone shared with me an illustration of a chamois. I'm sure you have one of these in your house. It's one of those cloths that can absorb a lot of water. And if we dip that into the water, it represents digging deep into the things of God and taking care of ourselves emotionally and spiritually. And we take that chamois out dripping wet and we squeeze it out. We were squeezing ourselves out for our family and for our communities and for the people that God has put in our path. And as we squeeze, that water is given, that refreshment is given to others. But as women, what we often do, instead of going back to refresh, we just keep squeezing and we squeeze and we squeeze. And pretty soon there's just drops dripping out. And we think, oh, I'm so exhausted. What do I need to do? I need to just keep squeezing. And so we keep trying to give, but we have nothing left. And it's so important that we take time to put that chamois back in the water, for us to get back in God's presence, for us to get healthy emotionally and physically so that we can care for the people that we love the most. And I know from firsthand experience how hard this is to actually put into practice. We'll tell each other all the time, girl, you need to take care of yourself. But when it comes down to it, we have a really hard time carving out space for us to do that in our own lives. But I found for me, if I'm not having time in the Word with God, if I'm not having quiet moments, whether it's a walk by myself or time to journal or to read a book that's going to refresh my soul, pretty soon I have nothing to give, and then I'm just cranky and irritable with the people that I love. So let me give you the encouragement I'm giving myself as well. Let's be women who fill ourselves up, who drink from the source so that we have a continual supply of goodness to share with those around us. I think one of the greatest presents that God wrapped into the marriage gift that He gave us as husband and wife is an ability to be known and to know someone else intimately. You get to know their likes and their dislikes, their funny habits and their silly sense of humor, but you also get to know each other's gifts and talents in a way that most people in the world won't be privy to see. So what a great opportunity as husband and wife to cultivate those gifts and talents and be a champion for your spouse and whatever God puts on their heart to pursue. Those talents might be as simple as being a great house manager and having the kids to bed on time and just cultivating relationship, or they might be something outside of the home but for God's kingdom purposes. They might be a skill or a trade, something that they're really good at. So how can we as husband and wife encourage and cultivate those gifts in the other without stifling them? Because as human beings, I know for myself, I'm really selfish. So I'm all about my husband, like helping me pursue my dreams, but it's a little bit harder to take off that mantle of selfishness and really focus on where my husband's strengths are, his gifts, talents, dreams, and passions, and how I can come alongside him. So the first thing I want to do is I want to be his cheerleader. This is something that I know is important to him, and I want to be the one who's coming alongside and letting him know with my words and my attitudes, I believe in you, and I think you'd be great at this. If we fail, we fail together. I think doing acts of service in an especially busy or stressful season as they're pursuing those gifts and talents is important too. I have to lower my expectations. If I'm encouraging my husband to go and do great things, but then he's stressed doing them and I'm like super grumpy with him about it, that's sort of sending mixed messages. So I want to make sure that I'm being supportive and encouraging with my acts of service in those seasons. One of the great things about being in close proximity with your spouse is that sometimes you see gifts, talents, and strengths that they don't even realize they have themselves. And you get to be the one to champion them and to show them, man, I think you'd be great at this because I've seen you be great at this and this and this. So if you want to pursue that, I'm right beside you. Philippians 2:4 reminds us that we shouldn't just be looking out for our own interests, but also the interests of others. And what a great opportunity in our own marriages to not just look out for ourselves, but to help our spouse pursue their dreams, passions, and talents.